In the shadowed corridors of history, nations have risen on the promise of abundance and fallen when the earth itself turned against them. Resource wars are not merely contests of armies. They are slow strangulations of societies, where the struggle for oil, water, minerals, or fertile land becomes the silent architect of decline. Before the first shot is fired, the soil is already thinning, the wells running dry, the trade routes tightening like nooses. What begins as a quiet competition for survival ends in the exhaustion of empires. No one understood, in those early moments, that the true enemy was not the rival across the border, but the finite nature of the ground beneath their feet. The collapse did not begin with chaos. It began quietly, in the ledgers of scarcity and the calculations of men who believed they could seize what the land would no longer give freely. Across the ancient Near East, city-states once thrived along the Fertile Crescent, their walls rising from mud and ambition. Grain, water from the rivers, and timber from distant hills formed the foundation of power. Daily life moved to the rhythm of the seasons. Farmers tended the irrigation canals at dawn, merchants weighed copper and tin in the markets, and priests offered sacrifices for continued abundance. Children played in the dust of streets that smelled of bread and livestock. Yet beneath this routine, the rivers were shifting their courses, the forests receding under the axes of expanding populations. Early warning signs appeared as distant disputes over grazing lands and access to springs. These were dismissed as local quarrels, the ordinary friction of neighboring peoples. By the time the signs became clear, it was already too late. The first resource wars of recorded history were forming, not as grand campaigns, but as incremental seizures that drained the strength of entire regions. In the centuries that followed, the pattern repeated with ruthless consistency. The struggle for salt, for iron, for the black liquid that would later power machines, reshaped the destinies of kingdoms. Daily existence in these societies remained deceptively ordinary even as the pressures mounted. Artisans continued to forge tools, women carried water from wells that sank lower each year, and rulers issued decrees promising prosperity. Yet the invisible warnings accumulated, harvests that failed more frequently, caravans that returned empty, treaties that collapsed under the weight of unmet demands. The collapse did not announce itself with banners and drums. It seeped into the grain stores, into the empty pens of livestock, into the quiet conversations of men who watched the horizon for rain that never came. Anticipation hung in the air like dust before a storm, though few could name the storm that was gathering. Rising tension often arrived through the decisions of those in power. Leaders, facing dwindling reserves, chose expansion over restraint. They sent armies to seize fertile valleys or mineral-rich hills, believing that conquest would restore the balance. These choices were made in chambers thick with the smoke of oil lamps, where maps were unrolled and fingers traced the paths of future campaigns. Mistakes compounded, overextension of supply lines, underestimation of the enemy's resolve, the refusal to adapt when the land itself resisted. The system began to fail not at the moment of defeat, but earlier, when the cost of securing resources exceeded the value they could provide. Soldiers marched on empty stomachs, their boots worn thin on roads that led only to more scarcity. The people at home felt the first tremors as taxes rose and food grew scarce, though the full rupture still lay ahead. When the system truly began to fail, the failure was measured in human terms. Markets emptied. Families rationed what little remained. The sounds of ordinary life, the clatter of workshops, the laughter of children, gave way to a heavier silence, broken only by the distant roll of artillery or the hurried footsteps of refugees. Social bonds frayed under the pressure of hunger and fear. Trust eroded between neighbors who once shared wells. Governments, desperate to maintain control, imposed harsher measures that only accelerated the breakdown. The resource war, once framed as a path to security, had become a mechanism of mutual exhaustion. Nations that entered the conflict believing they could claim lasting advantage emerged diminished, their treasuries emptied, their populations thinned, their landscapes scarred by the very struggle meant to preserve them. The human consequences unfolded with grim inevitability. Villages that had stood for generations were abandoned as the soil gave out or the water sources were contested beyond use. Cities swelled with the displaced, then strained under the weight of too many mouths and too little to feed them. Disease followed scarcity as surely as night follows day. The elderly and the young suffered first, their bodies marking the true cost of the conflict. Survivors carried the memory of what had been lost, not only land or oil fields, but the quiet certainty that tomorrow would resemble today. In the aftermath, the social fabric did not simply tear. It unraveled thread by thread, leaving communities that could no longer recognize themselves. The war for resources had not merely weakened the state, it had altered the inner life of its people. Long after the last formal treaty was signed, the historical impact continued to shape the region. Borders drawn in the heat of resource competition often ignored the deeper realities of watersheds and mineral deposits, planting the seeds of future conflict. Economies that had once been diversified narrowed around the remaining extractable wealth, becoming brittle and dependent. Political systems, hardened by wartime emergency powers, struggled to return to earlier forms of governance. The memory of scarcity lingered in folklore, in laws, in the cautious habits of generations that followed. What had begun as a contest for survival left behind a landscape of diminished capacity, where the next crisis found less resilience than the last. The nations involved carried the scars forward, their trajectories permanently altered by the exhaustion of both people and land. In other corners of the world, the same pattern repeated under different skies. The pursuit of rubber, of nitrate fields, of subterranean reserves of coal or petroleum drew distant powers into collisions that left local populations caught between advancing forces. Daily life in these contested zones shifted from the familiar cycle of planting and harvest to the unpredictable rhythms of occupation and resistance. Warning signs appeared in the form of foreign surveyors mapping the earth, of prices that fluctuated wildly with rumor, of young men conscripted into armies they did not fully understand. By the time the full weight of the conflict arrived, the capacity for peaceful adaptation had already been spent. The collapse, once again, revealed itself as a process rather than a single catastrophe. Key decisions made in distant capitals accelerated the decline. Advisors calculated the value of a contested river or a disputed oil seam without accounting for the long attrition that would follow. Military campaigns were launched with the expectation of quick resolution, only to bog down in terrain that resisted both invader and defender. The pressure of maintaining distant supply lines drained resources faster than the contested prize could replenish them. Mistakes of overconfidence and misjudgment compounded until the original objective, securing the resource, became secondary to the sheer effort of surviving the war itself. The system of national strength, once thought robust, began to fail under the cumulative weight of these choices. As the failure deepened, the social order transformed. Institutions that had mediated disputes and distributed goods lost their authority. Informal networks of survival emerged in their place, some cooperative, others predatory. Fear became a constant companion, visible in the guarded eyes of those who still possessed something worth taking. The landscape itself bore witness. Forests cut for fortifications, rivers diverted or polluted by military necessity, fields left fallow because the hands that once worked them were gone. The resource war had rewritten the relationship between people and the land, leaving both poorer than before. The long-term consequences extended beyond the immediate generation. Historians would later trace the weakened capacity of these nations to the years of resource conflict, noting how the exhaustion of human and material capital limited their ability to respond to later challenges. Cultural memory preserved the trauma in songs, in place names, in the cautious politics of those who inherited the diminished inheritance. The earth, stripped of its most accessible wealth, offered less to those who remained. What had been fought over with such intensity often proved less abundant than the combatants had imagined, the prize itself diminished by the violence required to claim it. In the quiet that followed the guns, the true measure of the collapse became visible. Not in the formal records of territory gained or lost, but in the emptied villages, the abandoned irrigation systems, the generations that grew up knowing scarcity as a permanent condition. The resource wars had not merely settled questions of ownership. They had reduced the overall capacity of the societies involved to sustain themselves. The process was complete when the memory of abundance itself began to fade, replaced by the harder knowledge that the land's gifts were neither endless nor easily seized. Looking back across the centuries, the pattern holds its haunting consistency. Resource wars weaken nations not solely through the destruction of battle, but through the gradual erosion of the foundations that make a society resilient. The warning signs are almost always present in the thinning of forests, the lowering of water tables, the rising cost of what was once taken for granted. Yet the decisions that follow often deepen the crisis rather than resolve it. By the time the full consequences are understood, the capacity for recovery has already been compromised. The earth continues its slow cycles, indifferent to the maps drawn over it, while the nations that fought for its riches carry forward the quieter, more enduring defeat.